First class? You've got to be kidding me. The words cut through the cabin like a knife, spoken in a mocking tone just loud enough to be overheard. 3 lawyers, dressed in crisp suits and polished shoes, leaned toward one another, smirking as their eyes locked on the man who had just stepped into the aisle. He was tall, with tired eyes, and a worn jacket that had seen better days. His shirt was plain, his shoes scuffed. Nothing about him screamed wealth or power. To the lawyers, he was an anomaly, someone who didn't belong in their carefully curated world of privilege. Probably sat in the wrong section, another lawyer muttered with a chuckle, tilting his glass of water like it was fine wine. The man said nothing. He kept his head low, shifting his carry-on beneath the seat. His movements were calm, deliberate, as if he'd learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than protest. But the whispers didn't stop. Imagine blowing your savings just to sit here once, the third lawyer sneered, leaning back as if claiming more space would prove his superiority. Their laughter was hushed, but not hidden. Each jab was a dagger, designed to humiliate without ever being addressed directly. The man sat tall, his hands folded on his lap. He stared straight ahead, his face unreadable, though the muscles in his jaw betrayed a quiet tension. Around them, other passengers shifted uneasily. Some avoided eye contact. Others pretended to focus on magazines or phones, their silence speaking volumes. A flight attendant approached, her smile professional, but her eyes betraying uncertainty. She glanced at the lawyers, then at the quiet passenger, as though weighing whether to intervene. But she walked on, the air around her heavy with hesitation. The engines began to hum, preparing for takeoff, yet the real turbulence had already begun, tension swirling in the space between a man who refused to defend himself and 3 men who believed they had already won. And as the plane prepared to leave the ground, one unspoken question lingered in the air. How much longer could he endure their contempt before the truth revealed itself? Maybe he got the seat on some government handout. The words dripped with sarcasm, followed by muffled laughter from the 3 lawyers. Their mocking voices carried just enough to reach nearby passengers, though not loud enough to draw the flight attendant's attention. The cruel precision of their tone made every word sting. The man sat still, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His eyes remained on the seat back in front of him, as though he could will the voices to disappear. But silence didn't shield him. It only seemed to embolden them. "Bet he doesn't even know which wine to order," one sneered, leaning back with a smirk. "First class is wasted on some people," another chimed in, swirling his glass as if to underline the point. Around them the cabin carried a strange unease. A few passengers caught the exchange, their expressions flickering with discomfort. A woman across the aisle frowned, then quickly looked away, pretending to dig through her purse. A businessman shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie as though distraction could erase what he had just heard. But no one spoke up. No one dared. The man exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. He'd lived this scene before, humiliation dressed as humor, disrespect masked as banter, and he knew the cost of reacting too quickly, so he chose restraint, letting the comments roll over him like waves against stone. The lawyers weren't finished. One leaned closer to his companions, whispering loudly enough for everyone in the first row to hear. "Should have put him in the back where he belongs." The laughter that followed was sharper this time, and with it, a heavier silence fell over the cabin. Every passenger could feel it. The cruelty had gone beyond subtle jabs. This was deliberate. The man's fingers tightened slightly against his knees, his body language the only sign of unease. Still, he didn't answer. His silence became its own kind of strength, though few around him understood it. The engines roared louder, carrying the plane higher into the sky. Yet inside the cabin, the atmosphere sank lower, suffocating under the weight of injustice. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their silence as damning as the insults themselves. The humiliation was no longer private. It was shared by everyone who chose not to speak. And in that quiet, a question lingered, pressing on every conscience in the room. How much longer would this man have to endure before the tables turned? "Excuse me, miss. Are you sure he belongs up here?" The words, smug and deliberate, came from the aisle where the lawyers sat. One of them raised his hand, gesturing toward the man in the worn jacket, as though he were pointing out a misplaced bag. The cabin, already tense, grew even quieter. The flight attendant paused mid-step. Her professional smile faltered just for a moment. Her eyes flicked toward the man, then back to the lawyers. "Sir, if he has a boarding pass for this seat—" "Then let's see it," another lawyer interrupted, his tone mocking. "First class is reserved for paying passengers, isn't it?" The demand hung heavy in the air. Heads turned. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice now leaned in subtly, waiting for the next move. The man didn't flinch. Without complaint, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the folded boarding pass. His hand was steady, though his silence carried more weight than any words could. He offered it calmly to the attendant. She glanced at it, her cheeks flushing as she read the seat assignment. It was correct. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, her voice tinged with embarrassment. She returned the slip with a slight bow of her head, as though apologizing without saying the words aloud. The lawyers leaned back, smirking. One whispered just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Guess the system really has lowered its standards." Some passengers looked down, ashamed to meet the man's gaze. Others stared at him with pity, as if he were a charity case rather than an equal. In a matter of seconds, his dignity had been placed under scrutiny for all to see. Still, he straightened in his seat, slipping the pass back into his pocket with deliberate care. No anger, no outburst, only composure. That quiet strength was the only defense he allowed himself. But as the plane soared higher, the humiliation had already sunk deeper. The cabin no longer saw him as just another traveler. He had been marked, judged, and diminished. What they didn't realize was that this silence was not weakness. It was patience. And soon, that patience would reveal a truth no one could ignore. The laughter around him faded into a dull hum, but the sting of humiliation lingered. He sat motionless in his seat, staring ahead, while inside his mind, a door slowly opened. Behind it lay memories he carried everywhere, memories of battles fought long before this flight ever took off. He was back in his childhood neighborhood. The streets were cracked, the paint peeling from houses that leaned with age. His mother worked 2 jobs, her hands rough from endless shifts, yet she always managed to smile when he returned home from school. Dinner was often simple, rice, beans, sometimes nothing more, but it was shared with love. He remembered the classroom where teachers doubted him. The way a counselor once said, "Boys like you rarely make it far." Those words had cut deep, but instead of breaking him, they became fuel. Every insult, every dismissal, every rejection planted a fire in his heart that told him he had to prove them wrong. There were the nights spent studying under dim streetlights when the electricity was cut off. The days he wore hand-me-down shoes that pinched his feet, walking to interviews where he was told, "We'll call you," though the call never came. He learned early how it felt to be overlooked, to be underestimated, to be told in 1,000 subtle ways that he did not belong. And yet, through every slight, he stood taller. Through every rejection, he worked harder. Where others saw barriers, he forced open doors. His calm now was not born of passivity, but of survival, of years spent knowing that dignity was his shield when the world tried to strip it away. Back on the plane, his fingers brushed against the worn strap of his watch. A gift from his father, who had told him as a boy, "Son, never let their judgment decide your worth. Time will prove who you are." And time had proven him right, again and again. The lawyers thought their ridicule was unique, cutting sharper than any insult he'd faced before. But to him, this was just another test in a long line of trials. What they couldn't see, what no one could see yet, was that the boy who once studied under flickering streetlights had become far more than the world expected. And soon, in this very cabin, that truth would break through their arrogance like sunlight through storm clouds. People should sit where they belong. The lawyer's voice cut through the hum of the engines, sharp and deliberate. This time it wasn't whispered or muttered. It was loud, clear, and meant to be heard by everyone in first class. His companions chuckled, emboldened by his boldness, while the man in the worn jacket sat still, his face calm, but his silence heavy. The words lingered in the air like smoke. Passengers shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking from the lawyers to the quiet passenger. The unspoken discomfort spread, filling the aisle with tension that even the hum of the jet couldn't drown out. Across the row, a child's small voice pierced the silence. "Mum, why are those men being so mean to him?" The question carried innocence, but it struck harder than any insult. The mother hushed the child, her cheeks flushing as she whispered, "Shh, not now." But it was too late. Everyone had heard. Heads turned. Some passengers looked down in shame, while others bit their lips, pretending the words hadn't landed. The lawyers smirked, undeterred. One leaned back, folding his arms with arrogance. "You'd think people would have the decency to know their place," he muttered. His friend laughed, shaking his head as if the man beside them were nothing more than an unworthy intruder in their space. The quiet passenger's fingers tapped once against his knee before going still again. His patience was deliberate, his silence measured. But inside, the weight of their cruelty pressed down, just as it had countless times before. The flight attendant glanced nervously toward the scene, her steps faltering as she passed with the drink cart. She wanted to intervene. Everyone could see it, but hesitation anchored her. The man remained unmoved. No rebuttal, no raised voice. Just silence so thick it seemed to echo louder than their jeers. And yet, in that silence, something shifted. The child's question hung in the air like a mirror, forcing the cabin to see the cruelty for what it was. The lawyers thought they had won this round, but what they couldn't see was that their arrogance had already begun to unravel, thread by thread, under the weight of their own words. People should sit where they belong. The lawyer's voice cut through the hum of the engines, sharp and deliberate. This time it wasn't whispered or muttered. It was loud, clear, and meant to be heard by everyone in first class. His companions chuckled, emboldened by his boldness, while the man in the worn jacket sat still, his face calm, but his silence hurt, heavy. The words lingered in the air like smoke. Passengers shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking from the lawyers to the quiet passenger. The unspoken discomfort spread, filling the aisle with tension that even the hum of the jet couldn't drown out. Across the row, a child's small voice pierced the silence. "Mum, why are those men being so mean to him?" The question carried innocence, but it struck harder than any insult. The mother hushed the child, her cheeks flushing as she whispered, "Shh, not now." But it was too late. Everyone had heard. Heads turned. Some passengers looked down in shame, while others bit their lips, pretending the words hadn't landed. The lawyers smirked, undeterred. One leaned back, folding his arms with arrogance. "You'd think people would have the decency to know their place," he muttered. His friend laughed, shaking his head, as if the man beside them were nothing more than an unworthy intruder in their space. The quiet passenger's fingers tapped once against his knee before going still again. His patience was deliberate, his silence measured. But inside, the weight of their cruelty pressed down, just as it had countless times before. The flight attendant glanced nervously toward the scene, her steps faltering as she passed with the drink cart. She wanted to intervene. Everyone could see it, but hesitation anchored her. The man remained unmoved. No rebuttal, no raised voice. just silence so thick it seemed to echo louder than their jeers. And yet, in that silence, something shifted. The child's question hung in the air like a mirror, forcing the cabin to see the cruelty for what it was. The lawyers thought they had won this round, but what they couldn't see was that their arrogance had already begun to unravel, thread by thread, under the weight of their own words. The seatbelt light blinked on. The cabin hushed as the plane dipped gently, beginning its descent. Passengers adjusted their seats, buckled straps, and prepared for landing. It was routine, until the speaker's cracking cold, and the captain's voice broke through. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Upon arrival, we ask that the governor of this state remain seated. Security will escort him from the aircraft first." A stunned silence swept through the cabin. The lawyers froze for only a moment, then burst into laughter. One leaned back, shaking his head. "Governor? On this flight?" He glanced at his companions, grinning. "What governor would fly coach and then sneak into first class?" Another chuckled, adding, "Probably some imposter trying to feel important. Can you imagine?" Their mockery rippled again, but this time the laughter didn't catch on. The other passengers weren't smiling. They were confused, curiosity and tension tightening the air. Eyes shifted around the cabin. Who was it? Who could it be? The whispers started soft, then grew louder as passengers scanned the faces around them. Every glance seemed to land finally on the man in the worn jacket. Still he remained motionless, calm, silent, waiting. The engines whined as the plane dipped lower, lights of the city flickering through the windows. The lawyers kept laughing, but there was a nervous edge creeping into their voices now. Maybe the captain just likes a joke," one muttered, though his smile faltered. And then it happened. The man slowly straightened in his seat. He reached down, collected his modest carry-on, and rose to his feet with quiet dignity. His presence filled the cabin instantly. No grand gestures, no need for words, just the weight of truth settling over every mocking laugh, every whispered doubt. The silence was deafening. Passengers gasped. A woman covered her mouth. The child from earlier leaned forward, wide-eyed, whispering, "Mom, it's him." The lawyers stared, their smirks collapsing into stunned disbelief. Their eyes darted between each other, searching for some way to laugh it off. But there was nothing left to say. The man's voice, steady and low, carried further than any shout could. "Excuse me." He stepped into the aisle, his calm composure now undeniable authority. And in that moment, the entire cabin understood. The man they mocked, dismissed, and humiliated was the leader of their state. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a sudden wave. The man in the worn jacket, quiet, patient, and endlessly mocked, now stood revealed as the very governor they had all heard announced. The air itself seemed to shift. Where moments ago there was ridicule, now there was reverence, stunned and heavy. The lawyers froze in their seats, their smirks drained from their faces, replaced with wide eyes and slack jaws. One tried to laugh, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips, but it died instantly when the man's steady gaze met his. Another fumbled with his tie, suddenly uncomfortable in his expensive suit. The third pressed his palms against his knees, shrinking back as though the seat itself might swallow him whole. Passengers stared in awe, some whispering, others too stunned to speak. A woman who had earlier avoided his eyes now leaned forward, her face filled with regret. The businessman who had buried himself in his tie looked down, ashamed. Their silence, once complicit, had become something else entirely, an admission that they had stood by while cruelty played out before them. The child across the aisle spoke again, her small voice piercing the tension. "Mom, he's the governor." The mother, her eyes glistening with embarrassment, nodded softly, unable to hide her shame. And through it all, the man's composure never wavered. His silence, once mistaken for weakness, now glowed as incredible strength. The restraint he had shown in the face of humiliation revealed itself as the discipline of a leader, a man who had carried dignity through storms most could not endure. The lawyers could not look at him. They shifted in their seats, their arrogance shattered. For the first time, their power, their wealth, their polished suits meant nothing. They had mocked a man whose authority dwarfed their petty cruelty. One finally whispered, almost to himself, He's the governor." The words hung in the air, both confession and defeat. The governor did not linger in their shame. He simply adjusted the strap of his carry-on, his movements calm and deliberate. He offered no rebuke, no lecture. His very presence was enough, a silent reminder of the danger of judging a man by appearance alone. And as the cabin sat in stunned silence, every passenger knew the balance of power had shifted forever. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, the aircraft gliding along the runway. Inside, the cabin remained hushed, passengers still reeling from the revelation that the man they mocked, dismissed and pitied was in fact their state's governor. As the plane slowed, the captain's voice returned, firm yet respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated, as Governor will be escorted off the aircraft first." All eyes turned toward him. Yet he showed no trace of arrogance, no spark of vengeance. He simply rose from his seat, steady and composed, lifting his modest carry-on bag with the same quiet dignity he had carried all flight. The lawyers shrank back, unable to meet his gaze. Their earlier smugness had crumbled into shame, their laughter silenced by the weight of truth. Passengers who had once looked on with doubt now looked with awe, their silence transformed into unspoken admiration. He gave no speech, no reprimand. Instead, he nodded respectfully at the flight attendants who stood straighter in his presence. His eyes softened as they landed on the child who had asked, so innocently, why the men were being mean. Bending slightly, he offered the child a gentle smile. "Always remember," he said softly, his voice warm yet steady. "Kindness costs not but it means everything." The child beamed, clutching their parent's hand as the governor straightened once more. He turned toward the exit, walking calmly down the aisle as security waited just beyond the door. With every step, the lesson of the moment sank deeper into the hearts of those watching. Power doesn't always announce itself with wealth, and dignity often wears humility. By the time he disappeared through the cabin door, the message was clear. Respect should never depend on appearances, because the one you belittle today may be the one who leads tomorrow.